Let's be honest, life isn't easy right now. This article contains major spoilers for the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian. Viewer discretion is advised. It's no secret that Mandalorians are some of the fiercest warriors in the Star Wars universe. One such Mandalorian is Din Djarin, or Mando, as he's often referred to, the main protagonist of the ongoing Disney Plus series The Mandalorian. As COVID-19 has spread across the world, millions of people have been forced into lockdowns and quarantines. As a battle-hardened Mandalorian warrior, Djarin became a prominent member of the Bounty Hunters Guild and quickly made a name for himself as one of the best hunters in the Outer Rim. Many of us are holed up in tiny apartments with no yards. That all changed, however, after he took a job from a member of an Imperial Remnant faction. The show is set 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, who offered him a big reward for the acquisition of an asset on the planet Arvala-7. Djarin soon realized that this asset is a Force-sensitive child who belongs to the same species as Jedi Grandmaster Yoda, and thus, the nickname, Baby Yoda, was born. Many are separated from friends and family, with our only method of communication being via video conferencing apps. Some are even stranded in unfamiliar places, with no real way of telling when we'll be able to get home again. So yeah, bad times. Hopefully, however, many of us have found our own ways of coping. Djarin took the child to the Imperial Remnant faction, but he soon regretted it and decided to rescue him. Together, they travel across the galaxy while also trying not to get killed along the way. To protect both himself and the child, Mando has a variety of weapons and tools at his disposal. Maybe you're throwing yourself into your work, if you're lucky enough to do that. Therefore, this article will take a closer look at the equipment that Din Djarin owns in The Mandalorian. Mandalorian helmets have long been associated with the Star Wars creed, and Din Djarin's helmet is no exception. Maybe you're occupying yourself with your family. Maybe you're reading, or binge-watching, or creating. Just like with any other Mandalorian helmet, Djarin's features a T-shaped visor and entirely conceals his face. Or maybe, and no judgment, here, seriously, you're punctuating your days with a drink or two. That's certainly true for many households across America, and in May 2020, Google released a number of statistics regarding people's cocktail-based searches during the pandemic. Now, thanks to this report, we can pinpoint which states are loving which cocktails. From old classics to unexpected wildcards, these are the most popular cocktails of all. Cheers. Paloma. We begin with the Paloma, which has so far been the cocktail of choice in Arizona, California, and Texas, all states which sit along the Mexican border. And that might not come as too much of a shock, considering the drink's background. Although the exact origins of the Paloma are a little murky, according to Taste Cocktails, some believe that it was created by Don Javier Delgado Corona, who was the owner and bartender of La Capilla, one of the oldest bars in Tequila, Mexico. It's said that the cocktail is named after La Paloma, which literally means, the dove, a popular Mexican folk song composed in the 19th century. In case you're unfamiliar with this drink, the Paloma is essentially tequila and grapefruit juice. Shake 2 ounces of tequila, 4 ounces of grapefruit juice, half an ounce of squeezed lime juice in a cocktail shaker with ice. Furthermore, Djarin's tribe follows the way of the Mandalore, a religion where members were not allowed to remove their helmets in public, or else they can't put them back on. Pour the mixture into a glass filled with ice cubes, and top it up with grapefruit soda. The only time that Djarin took his helmet off in public was in the episode, Chapter 8, Redemption, when an explosion from an E-Web heavy repeating blaster cannon's power supply badly wounded him. IG-11, an IG-series assassin droid who was reprogrammed as a nurse droid, told Djarin that he was not a living thing, which allowed the reformed being to remove Djarin's helmet and treat his wounds with a Bacta spray. Mando's helmet also comes with a variety of perks, such as tracking heat signatures, long-range audio, and detecting recent footsteps left on the ground. Throw on a little garnish of lime, and voila, pure refreshing summer joy, and the perfect drink for beating the heat in those Mexico-adjacent states. Unfortunately, there may in fact be another reason for the Paloma's current popularity. These perks especially became useful when Djarin had to locate nearby individuals, whether they be bounties or simply those in need of Mando's assistance. Armor. Din Djarin's Mandalorian armor not only looks cool, but it is also extremely durable. Just like with most other suits of Mandalorian armor, Djarin'S is made out of a powerful metal alloy called beskar, which is known to withstand blaster fire and even the might of a lightsaber. In March 2020, the supposed creator of the drink, Don Javier, died at the age of 95. Incredibly, he had been bartending for 75 of those years. Old-fashioned. The old-fashioned has got to be one of the world's most famous cocktails, so it's little surprise that it's so popular in so many states. According to Google's report, the old-fashioned is the most searched cocktail in as many as 7 different states: Massachusetts, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Oregon, Virginia, and Washington. The origin of the old-fashioned can be connected to the first use of the word cocktail, which dates back to at least 1806, when the term was used in the Balance and Columbian Repository, a New York newspaper. The editor of the paper called for cocktails to be made up of spirits, sugar, water, and bitters, which is remarkably close to what we know as the modern old-fashioned. Back then, however, the term old-fashioned was used to describe the earliest ways in which cocktails were made. In this sense, you could have a rum old-fashioned or a tequila old-fashioned. Before long, the term had become synonymous with the whiskey version of the drink. Liquor.com's recipe for the old-fashioned is easy enough. Add half a teaspoon of sugar, 3 dashes of Angostura bitters, and a teaspoon of water into a glass with rocks, then stir until the sugar is dissolved. Since Djarin's armor is badly damaged in the show's sophomore episode, Chapter 2, The Child, he brings the large payment of beskar from his mission on Arvala-7 to his tribe's armorer, who ends up smelting it in order to craft a new cuirass. Instead of having a red and gray color scheme in the vein of the original armor, this new armor is metallic silver, similar to Djarin's helmet. In Chapter 8, Redemption, the armorer announces the formation of Djarin's clan, Clan Mudhorn, which is made up of himself and the child. To coincide with this formation, the armorer inscribes the skull of the Mudhorn on his right pauldron as his signet, which sets him apart from all the other Mandalorians in the galaxy. Whipcord. Din Djarin's whipcord, located in his right vambrace, has helped him get out of many sticky situations. In Chapter 6, The Prisoner, for example, Djarin fights several New Republic security droids on a prison transport that he and several other mercenaries infiltrated in order to break out a prisoner on board. Then fill the glass with ice cubes, add 2 ounces of bourbon, and gently stir to combine. Throughout the fight, Mando uses the grappling hook to behead one droid and uses it again to bring another droid closer to the one that's being incinerated. Express the oil of an orange peel over the glass, then drop it in to garnish. Easy, and proof that, sometimes, the old ways are the best. Hurricane. The Hurricane is another repeat occurrence on Google's list of state cocktails, making appearances at the top of the list in both Alabama and Colorado. Djarin later discovers that the prisoner they're rescuing is a Twi'lek man named Chin, who Djarin supposedly left behind on one of their missions together. Honestly, we can't make much of a connection between these states and the Hurricane, since the cocktail's history derives from other places entirely. A few versions of the Hurricane's origin exist, but the most popular stems from the Deep South. This version of the tale posits that the Hurricane was first created at Pat O'Brien's, a legendary bar in the French Quarter of New Orleans. After Chin is broken out of his jail cell, the other mercenaries betray Mando by locking him at that exact cell. According to this story, there was a surplus rum supply in the wake of World War II, which had seen bourbon and Scotch stocks run down, and barrels of the stuff were pouring into New Orleans via both the Mississippi and the city's port. In order to shift all that rum, distributors forced bars to buy multiple cases in exchange for a case of whiskey. Luckily, Djarin escapes after he tethers a security droid near his cell door and rips off one of its arms, which he uses to open his cell. Bottom line, the moral of this story is don't mess with Mando. Flamethrower. Din Djarin's dual flamethrowers have also come in handy during many difficult situations. To help sales along, Benson O'Brien and his partner concocted the Hurricane. In Chapter 3, The Sin, Djarin takes down a number of stormtroopers to save the child from an Imperial remnant compound, and during the rescue, he burns a stormtrooper alive, who audibly screams in pain and agony as his death is taking place. Like any weapon in Star Wars, however, the flamethrowers have their limits. When Djarin was surrounded by bounty hunters who all wanted the child in The Sin, he used one of his flamethrowers to drive them away, but it ran out of juice before long. It's also worth mentioning that not everything Djarin has tried to incinerate is flammable. A 1956 recipe was published in Cabaret magazine by O'Brien's head bartender Louis Culligan, who some claim was the drink's real inventor. This recipe called for 4 ounces of gold rum, 2 ounces of lemon juice, and 2 ounces of Fasciola passion fruit syrup to be added to ice and shaken hard, then poured, unstrained, into a large hurricane glass. For example, the Deveronian mercenary Berg is seemingly impervious to Djarin's flamethrower when the latter tries to use it during their close quarters fight scene in The Prisoner. As it turns out, Deveronian's skin is quite flame-resistant. Whistling birds. When Djarin returns to the hidden Mandalorian group in the sewers with his Beskar payment in The Sin, the armorer offers to give him a mudhorn signet since that was the creature he killed during this mission. Thanks in particular to the striking glass in which it was served, the Hurricane quickly became one of the city's signature cocktails. Manhattan. You can probably guess where this one is popular. Djarin refuses, however, because he thinks that an enemy, the child, helped him kill the mudhorn, so the armorer uses the excess Beskar to instead build him a weapon, whistling birds. These small guided munitions were placed in his left vambrace. When deployed, the projectiles flew through the air while making a whistling sound before striking their targets and killing them with a small explosion. Google's analytics have the Manhattan coming top of the list in New Jersey, Illinois, and, shocker, New York itself. This vermouth-based cocktail was, in fact, one of the first to use vermouth in its recipe. According to Liquor.com, it's likely that the Manhattan first appeared in the 1880s, meaning it predates other vermouth cocktails such as the Martini, the Rob Roy, and the Bobby Burns. Now, the Manhattan Club in New York does make a claim to being the birthplace of the drink, with popular legend suggesting it was created for a party thrown in 1874 for Jenny Jerome, future mother to Winston Churchill. The armorer tells Djarin that these projectiles are rare, so he has mostly used them in tight spots. One example is later in The Sin, when Djarin fires the whistling birds at the stormtroopers surrounding him. Interestingly enough, Djarin is not the only Star Wars character to possess whistling birds. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, the Visual Dictionary states that a bounty hunter named Charybdis wore a Mandalorian rocket gauntlet loaded with whistling birds on his right arm. Considering Lady Churchill was in England at that time, however, it's likely the legend is more of a myth. But Liquor.com has traced the Manhattan story to another source. A bartender named William F. How he obtained this gauntlet is still up in the air, however. Grenades are not a unique weapon in the Star Wars universe, but they are still useful for Din Djarin. One time in The Mandalorian where grenades were especially helpful was in Chapter 11, The Heiress, when Djarin, Bo-Katan Kryze, and 2 other Mandalorians infiltrated an Imperial Gozanti-class cruiser transporting weapons. In this episode, the 4 warriors try to take the ship's bridge but end up encountering a squad of stormtroopers armed with heavy repeating blasters, all while the ship's captain is attempting to crash the ship at Moff Gideon's behest. Therefore, Djarin quickly devises a plan to get him and the other Mandalorians to the bridge. He asks the other Mandalorians to cover him as he charges toward the remaining stormtroopers. After getting close enough, Djarin throws 2 grenades at the squad and blows them up. If Kryze didn't take Djarin on her mission, then it likely would not have gone as well as it did in this scenario. Flash charges or flash grenades, for that matter, aren't exactly commonplace in the Star Wars universe, but for Din Djarin, they were especially useful in Chapter 5, The Gunslinger. This Season 1 episode sees Mando help aspiring bounty hunter Toro Calican capture a wanted assassin named Fennec Shand in order to pay for ship repairs back at the Mos Eisley spaceport. Early on in the episode, Djarin informs Calican in vivid detail of just what kind of bounty he's going up against. Fennec Shand is an elite mercenary. She made her name killing for all the top crime syndicates, including the Hutts. Mulhall, who worked at the Hoffman House in New York from the early 1880s. By his account, the Manhattan cocktail was invented by a man named Black, who kept a place 10 doors below Houston Street on Broadway in the 1860s. You can make a Manhattan for yourself by stirring 2 ounces of rye whiskey, 1 ounce of Italian vermouth and 2 dashes of Angostura bitters together with cracked ice, then straining into a chilled cocktail glass. Garnish with a twist or a cocktail cherry, then sit back and enjoy. If you go after her, you won't make it past sunrise. After they both discover, Later in the episode, that Shand is using a faraway ridge as a makeshift sniper nest. Djarin and Calacan use flash charges to blind Shand so that they can successfully apprehend her. Black would be proud. Screwdriver, the cocktail of choice for errant teens who have managed to successfully raid their parents' stash of booze. Note: don't do that, teens. The screwdriver is one of the simplest cocktails out there. Indeed, this might be the reason it has become so popular during lockdown, having made the top spot in Delaware, Kansas, and South Dakota. As with so many other cocktails, the screwdriver has conflicting origins. One story suggests the recipe began during World War II, when American Marines would liven up their orange juice with vodka. A 1944 account gives credit to the recipe to interned American flyers. Yet another version attributes the drink's origin to American oil workers in the Persian Gulf during the mid-20th century. In order to cope with their dangerous work and long hours, they too would mix vodka into orange juice, but since they had nothing to stir it with, they were forced to use their screwdrivers. Wherever it came from, there's no denying that this isn't the most difficult cocktail to mix. Simply add 1½ cups of orange juice and a cup of vodka into a pitcher, and pour over ice. Calacan would later kill Shand and betray Mando. Make sure you're using decent vodka and fresh orange juice, while keeping things cold, or this one might come out less. Summer refreshment, and more, horrifying first gulp of liquor at a young age. Kamikaze. The kamikaze is, according to Google's analytical report, the lockdown drink of choice for Idaho, Iowa, Maryland, North Dakota, and West Virginia. Despite the connotations of its name, the kamikaze originated in neither Japan nor during World War II. According to cocktail historian David Wondrich, via First We Feast, the kamikaze first appeared on the disco scene sometime around 1976. In his 1984 book Cocktail, the American screenwriter Haywood Gould dives a little deeper into the drink's history. Fortunately, Djarin ends up killing Calacan after blinding him with a flash charge when he least expected it. Blaster pistol. A wise man once said, "Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a blaster at your side." And even though Djarin knows next to nothing about the so-called hokey religion that he's looking for, he does almost always have a blaster at his side. While the show has never explained exactly how Mando got his hands on this average-looking blaster pistol à la Solo, a Star Wars story, the Forgotten Weapons YouTube channel explains that this highly detailed prop gun was likely inspired by the 1894 Bergmann No. 1 semi-automatic pistol, with slight modifications. Either way, Djarin demonstrates many times throughout The Mandalorian that he is very proficient with this handgun. The kamikaze is one of the classic disco cocktails invented by barbiturated teenagers, he writes. In fact, the very first fight scene of the series shows Mando slice an unidentified Quarren trawler in half with a circular door after shooting the controls with his pistol. Although their backstories aren't exactly identical, Djarin is only a few more close-quarter fight scenes away from being the Star Wars equivalent of John Wick, and that's definitely far from a bad thing. Ambon Phase Pulse Blaster. While Boba Fett first used a variation of this weapon in the animated segment from the infamous Star Wars Holiday Special, the Ambon Phase Pulse Blaster in The Mandalorian is arguably much more powerful than its animated counterpart. It's a senseless, infuriating concoction made of equal parts vodka, lime juice, and triple sec. Throughout the course of the series, Din Djarin has used this sniper rifle to either incapacitate or, more often than not, disintegrate anyone who stood in his path. These enemies can be as small as a Jawa or as big as a Trandoshan, both of whom were killed in the same episode, The Child. Djarin has also used the blaster to tase a wide variety of intergalactic scum, such as stormtroopers and crate dragons. More on that later. Interestingly enough, Djarin isn't the only character in the show to use this weapon. There are no standards for the kamikaze. In Chapter 4, Sanctuary, former rebel shock trooper Cara Dune uses the sniper rifle to protonate Saint into a man-made lake so that Mando can blow it up himself. Regardless of who possesses the rifle, there is no denying that it is one of more powerful tools in Din Djarin's arsenal. Jetpack. Star Wars fans have often associated jetpacks with Mandalorian culture, yet Djarin did not receive his own until the final episode of The Mandalorian Season 1. In Redemption, the armorer asked Mando if he has ever trained in the Rising Phoenix, to which he promptly responds that he has. It has no particular attributes that would distinguish a good kamikaze from a bad one, like a dry martini or a tart gimlet. The armorer then gives Mando a jetpack and sends him on his way to reunite the child, with its own kind. That jetpack would fortunately come in handy later in the episode when Djarin uses it to disable an incoming TIE fighter that just so happened to be piloted by Moff Gideon. It exists merely to confer a little cash on these pimpled baboons. Not exactly a glowing review for the good people of Idaho, Iowa, Maryland, North Dakota, and West Virginia there, but hey, times have changed. Djarin would also use the jetpack in the subsequent episode Chapter 9, The Marshal, when he flew out of the belly of a hungry crate dragon, which just so happened to have just eaten a bantha that was laden with explosives. Even though we as viewers have yet to see Djarin training with a jetpack during his early days as a young Mandalorian foundling, the Djarin that we see in the present day uses it like a true Mandalorian warrior. Luckily, even the most pimpled of baboons should be able to mix their own kamikaze. Squeeze 3/4 of an ounce of strained lemon juice into a shaker with ice, add 2 ounces of vodka, and 3/4 of an ounce of orange liqueur or triple sec. Shake vigorously for 20 seconds, then pour into a martini glass. Garnish with some fruit, throw on a little KC and the Sunshine Band, and dance your lockdown woes away. Grasshopper. While not quite as popular as some of the others out there, the Grasshopper nonetheless comes up as the favorite quarantine cocktail in Wisconsin and Nevada. Famed for its minty green appearance and sweet flavor, this drink is, according to Eater, popular among new drinkers and nostalgia-filled old folks alike. As Mark Latter, owner of New Orleans bar Tujags, tells the publication, "It's not a really strong drink, so if you give your 9-year-old a sip of this mint chocolate chip drink, it's not like giving them a sip of bourbon. Although, obviously, don't do this." The Grasshopper actually originates in Tujags, which opened in the French Quarter in 1856. The story goes that the bar and restaurant's owner, Philibert Guichet, invented the Grasshopper on a trip to New York for a cocktail competition. Having won second prize for the recipe, he brought it back to NOLA. The recipe is usually simple enough. Add 3/4 ounces of green crème de menthe, white crème de cacao, and light cream, into a shaker, then shake and strain into a cocktail glass and garnish with mint. Curiously enough, the Grasshopper is also closely associated with Wisconsin supper clubs, and Portland mixologist Jeffrey Morgenthaler credits that state's bartenders for getting him into Wisconsin's version of the Grasshopper, which involves serving it as a blended dessert drink that utilizes ice cream in its recipe. No wonder it's popular there right now. Bushwhacker. The favorite quarantine cocktail in Louisiana and North Carolina, the Bushwhacker is what Esquire describes as a chocolate piña colada milkshake. The cocktail dates back to 1975, when it was invented and sold at the Ship's Store and Sapphire Pub on St. Thomas, in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The drink was created by Angie Conigliaro and Tom Brockamp, the latter of whom was the Ship's Store's manager. Brockamp and Conigliaro decided to name their cocktail after a guest's dog, whose name was Bushwhack. By the end of 1975, the recipe had spread to the U.S. mainland, where it was sold at the Sandshaker Lounge in Florida. Today, it's a staple cocktail for beach loungers and tropical relaxation. Different places tend to have slightly different Bushwhacker recipes. For example, the U.S. Virgin Islands version differs slightly from that Floridian version sold at the Sandshaker Lounge. But let's go for the original here, for the sake of enjoying a little history. You'll need half an ounce of each of these ingredients: vodka, Baileys, coconut rum, Kahlua, amaretto, and dark rum. Blend them all together with 3/4 of a cup of crushed ice, and pour the mixture into a tall glass with chocolate syrup lining the inside edges. Add a cherry as garnish, and serve straight up, with whipped cream, if you'd prefer, which let's face it, you would. Whiskey Sour. Alaska and Pennsylvania are necking back the whiskey sours during quarantine, it appears. The recipe for this simple whiskey-based cocktail has existed since the 18th century, when it was used as a drink for sailors making long sea voyages. At the time, water was rarely considered safe to drink, and food would often spoil during the time it took to traverse the ocean. To combat this problem, the Royal Navy's Vice Admiral Edward Vernon began using the rations found on ships to concoct a drink his sailors could enjoy. Lemons and limes were in abundance, to help prevent scurvy, so it was added to liquor rum, at that point, and served on board Vernon's ships. These sailors then brought the recipe back to shore. For the English, the rum was usually swapped out for gin or brandy, but Americans tended to prefer whiskey, since it was easier to get hold of. In 1862, a writer named Jerry Thomas codified the recipe in the Bartender's Guide, and the whiskey sour only grew in popularity from there. These days, you can make a whiskey sour with about a couple of ounces of whiskey, an ounce of lemon juice, and half an ounce of syrup. Add the ingredients to a shaker over ice and shake hard. Then strain into a glass filled with ice, and garnish with a slice of lemon, lime, or orange. Drink near the sea. Cosmopolitan queen of the cocktails in Michigan, Rhode Island, and Vermont, is the Cosmopolitan. A favorite drink among the LGBT community, celebrities, and Carrie Bradshaw alike, the Cosmo's origin can likely be traced to Toby Cecchini, of the Odeon in Manhattan. Similar drinks had existed prior to the 1980s, including the Kamikaze and the Harpoon, but the Odeon is often regarded as the cradle of the modern Cosmopolitan. In 1987, Cecchini's co-worker Melissa Huffsmith introduced him to a similar drink that used Rose's lime cordial in its recipe. Cecchini shook the recipe up a little and used absolute citron, Cointreau, cranberry juice, and fresh lime juice. Cecchini's Cosmopolitan took off, and became an icon of pop culture when it was featured regularly on Sex and the City. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, it became one of America's most popular cocktails. All you need to do to make your own is combine 1.5 ounces of citrus vodka, half an ounce of Cointreau, an ounce of cranberry juice, and a 1/4 ounce of fresh lime juice, then shake well and strain into a chilled martini glass. Garnish with an orange twist and argue for 3 hours about whether you're a Carrie or a Samantha. Margarita. Finally, we've got margaritas. Funnily enough, the border states seem to be too preoccupied with their palomas to get their margaritas on, and these iconic cocktails actually top Google's list in Connecticut and Maine. Same as it ever was, with the margarita's beginnings, it's hard to really pin down the true story. According to one story, the cocktail was created in 1938, when Mexican restaurant owner Carlos Herrera came up with it in order to impress Marjorie King, an actress and showgirl of the time. Another story credits Texan socialite Margaret Sames with the drink's invention, claiming it was mixed by her at a house party in Mexico in 1948. Yet another story goes that it was named for actress Rita Hayworth, whose real name was the far cooler Margarita Casino. The truth is, nobody's really sure where it came from. It's at least thought that, according to David Wondrich, the drink evolved from another cocktail known as the Daisy, which mixed alcohol, citrus juice, and grenadine, over shaved ice. It's definitely worth noting that margarita is the Spanish word for daisy. Either way, this one's not too tricky. Moisten the rim of a rocks glass with a wedge of lime, then roll the glass in salt. Combine 2 ounces of Blanco tequila, 1 ounce of orange liqueur, and an ounce of lime juice in a shaker filled with ice. Shake and strain into the glass, over fresh ice. Happy days.